Okay, so UVing. What we want to do is we want to go over to the UV tab. And this is the interface where we are going to be UVing in. Now, if you don't have a UV split view like this, if you're only given one view, so for example, if your view looks like this by default, what you're going to have to do is you're going to have to click on this triangle here, go to Edit, UV 3D Split. This is going to give you two views or two viewports like this that are split, and you're able to make your selections, work on your 3D objects, do splitting, do whatever you need to do. And at the same time, you're going to see your UV editing or UV layout in this UV view. Now, over here we have our tools that we're going to be using for our UVs. And over here we have our lists. Now, what these lists are is they contain the properties for our objects. So if you might have noticed, one of my objects has a UV map already. Of course, this UV map is absolutely useless, but you know, it came with one nonetheless. So whenever you switch an object, like I did right now in my item menu here, every time I switch, this list gets updated with whatever properties or whatever maps this object might contain. So if you, sometimes in other maps you might get a surface normal map. Usually I keep these things deleted because they don't end up looking very nicely in Modo, especially if you end up making drastic changes to the models. Your normals end up being somewhat affected and not looking very nice. So oftentimes I just delete my surface normal maps. Most often I actually just leave UV maps, and I usually don't do my morph target work within Modo. Anyways, let's make a plane. Well, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take this mesh here, move it up, and what I'm going to do is I'm just going to easily just copy or select this polygon, press Ctrl C to copy that polygon, and I'm going to paste it into this empty object. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to use UV projection, and I'm going to left click in this viewport. Now before I left click, before you do this, what we're going to be doing is we're going to use this UV projection tool, and we're going to create a UV map. So we're going to project onto this object. Now, when you click this, you're going to notice that your property pane here changes. So if I click on any one of these tools, you notice that the properties adapt to whatever tool you're using. In this case, we're using the UV projection tool. Now, the UV projection tool does not get applied onto your model until you left click in the viewport. So I'm going to left click right now, and you will notice that not much has happened, except UVs have been applied to the object. As you can see right here in the list, this object now has a map 1, which is exactly what I specified in my system properties to be my, or system preferences to be my default name. Now if I click on any of these other objects, you'll notice again, no UV map except the one object that I created it to. Now this tool is still active, or it should be. So if I, for example, oh no, it actually got this deactivated once I selected my other object. So you know what, let's reapply that UV mapping again. Now what you might notice is that this UV mapping changed. Well, the reason why it changed is because now I've changed the axis onto which it's projected from. Now what this means is the UV mapping in this case is right now mapping on the X. So X is this way. So imagine as if I'm actually looking at my object this way. All I see is a straight line, and that is exactly how it's being represented in my UV view. If I was going to UV map it from the Y, I get pretty much the same, except I'm now mapping it down this way, because now I am looking down the Y axis. So I am looking from up there down onto the object. So what do we see? We see this, which is not much. What we really want is we want to fill this space as much as possible. So we're going to click on Z, and now you can see that this square is represented here. Now, it's kind of hard to see what kind of result you're getting without actually seeing a texture map being applied to your object. So let's do that. What I'm going to do is I'm going to press M, and you're going to get a polyset material. Now what this means is that you're going to apply or set a material or create a material that is going to be applied to this object's polygons. So you can type in UV test, which is, or whatever you want. This is the usual UV testing material that I create. So I'm just going to click OK. And you really don't see much yet. The object became slightly lighter, and that's because I created a new material for this object to have. So it's applied, but I haven't applied any texture maps to that material. So if we go over here, the shader tree, what we will have access is that we will have access to the material that we just applied to this object. This is where the material exists. So go to render, expand this, and now you will notice that there's a material UV test. So if you expand this material UV test, you will have the default material that this object contains. And of course, if we just go, it's actually selected by default. If we go down to properties and change the diffuse amount, you'll notice that the properties from that materials are in fact affecting this object. But what we really want is we want to apply a material or a texture to this plane. So we will do that by going to add layer over here and selecting image map. Now, once you have the image map selected, or once you have that property selected, you're going to get a window like this, and what you want to do is choose a texture. So usually you'll have to go to load image, find your texture or picture or any kind of photograph that you have on your hard drive, and select it. In my case, I'm going to be using this checkerboard map, which is very useful because what I get is something like this. And this tells me, this shows me how the UV map is, or how the texture is being applied to my object. In this case, I am getting the very full spectrum of this texture map. So if I, for example, move this vertex in my UV view, you'll notice that I'm getting distortions right now. And the whole point of texture mapping or UV mapping is that what you really want to do is you want to apply your UVs in a very non-stretch method. Because if I end up painting anywhere on this image, if I end up painting on the upper, like let's just say if I wanted to paint some streaks, like let's just say, maybe this object has been out in the rain and there's been some leaking going on, some water has been leaking and it's been, leaving some stains. Well, if I wanted to paint this very predictably, then if I'm painting in Photoshop, for example, where it's not a 3D application, it's a 2D application, and all I have is this texture map, then if I paint on the left side all the way across the right, and then I paint my streaks from the top to the bottom, then I expect for my result to be exactly the same in my 3D view, right? So let's go to the paint panel. Now I'm missing my view, so that's fairly simple to fix. I'm just going to go to 3D model. And select my object. Now, what we want to do is show you an example. Actually, I guess I'll do something else. I'm going to change this viewport to UV 3D split, because what I really want to illustrate is if I was in Photoshop, my result or my viewport would really look something like this. I have a 2D texture and that's it. Once this texture is finished in Photoshop or in this UV view, this texture, once saved, it's going to get reapplied to my 3D object. So if I take a paintbrush and I start painting colors on this object, So let's paint something dark, you know, those streaks that I was talking about earlier. If I start painting from the left to right, I get a result from left to right. It's predictable. If I start painting up to bottom, or top to bottom, then once again, I'm getting a very predictable result. And this is exactly what you want to be doing in, you know, with your UVs. You want to have a very predictable result. Now, the reason why you also want to use UVs versus other methods like, for example, PTEX or poly painting that, you know, ZBrush has and Mudbox have, is that UVs and texture maps are really portable. UVs can be used on feature films. They can be used in video games. It's a very common method of texturing, and you really don't have to teach yourself any different tools at all. The tools are exactly the same whether you're doing video games or if you're doing film. Your models might change. The density of your models might change, but the overall UVing process is always the same. The tools, they don't change. The other reason why you might want to use UVs is because it's a very old method. It's very standardized. And unlike PTEX, for example, what happens is PTEX is not very... I mean, it is portable. It's just that not every single application supports it yet. So Modo, for example, has no PTEX just yet. You're not able to paint in PTEX. You're not able to load a texture mapped object with PTEX, which means that PTEX is useless. You know, you might be UVing or you might be texture painting in whatever application like Mudbox that might have PTEX support. But as soon as you're done and you want to render your object in Modo, you can't because Modo does not support that method. Same thing with polypaint. If you're using ZBrush to polypaint and you're using those technologies, sure, it's great, you know, for painting because you do not have to worry about any kind of distortion, any UVs, and stuff like that. But the portability is very limited. You cannot go outside of ZBrush and use that vertex painting. So what do? Well, what you end up doing in ZBrush, for example, is you end up having to UV your model anyways. You then have to bake that polypaint into a texture map, and then that texture map can be moved from ZBrush. You can save it and load it in Modo, and that is how you get you know, your textured model in Modo, should you choose ZBrush for texturing. So textures are really portable, and that is what you want to do. You want to have a very portable you know, method of working, because if you end up moving from, like, let's just say if you're working on a production and you might end up needing you know, to throw your model into Houdini, for example, then what's going to happen is you're going to want to take that model and move it over to Houdini using whatever method possible to make sure that it gets moved from one application to another, and the result will stay the same, or at least your model should look the same. It should retain the way it looks. Of course, if you weren't able to move that information, well, then you're limiting yourself greatly. So anyways, we have this plane mapped. Now, let's just say if this map was a little bit more, or this object was a little bit more complex. Right now, what we have is we have this plane. Well, what if I was to have an object like this, right? Well, right now, this looks fine. I mean, my new polygons are mapped. But why is that? Well, what happens is every single one of these new polygons is automatically put, if you notice, if I click on this polygon here, every single one of these new polygons that I have extracted is put from the 0 to 1 space. Well, this is pretty good. But what if I had an object with no UVs, where the tool didn't create automatic UVs for me? And what if I had to UV map this? Well, let's go back to my UV panel here, or UV tab, and I'm going to go back to UV projection, and I'm going to once again click planar, and now we're going along the z-axis, as you can see here, the z, and I'm projecting right through. Well, from the front it looks okay. You know, if I look at this, it looks okay. There's really no stretching in this view. But all of a sudden, we see a lot of stretching here. Well, that's no good. Well, there's a few ways to fix this. I mean, right now, this object is still one piece. If I double click on it, it's all one piece. If I double click on it here, it's again one piece. One way to fix it, of course, is to take these edges and extend them. And of course, I can look at my 3D model. And if I extend these, and what I really want to do is I want to make sure that these squares are, well, square. So that looks pretty good. Of course, the other side, not so much. So I select that edge, and I move it along until these squares are fairly square. Now, with texture mapping, what you really want to do is you want to make sure that your map is readable. As in, if you're using a test map like this, a texture map like this, then you should always be able to read from left to right. Because as soon as you have something like, I'm going to give you an example here. If I rotate this object here, or I tear it off, make sure this tear off is on. If I flip this, for example, and I start painting on, from top to bottom, you might start noticing that, well, the lettering has been flipped. Well, so has the texture from the way it's being applied to this polygon. So if I paint to the top, I'm actually painting on the bottom. If I paint on top here, you start noticing, actually, I guess if I select edges, it might be a little bit clearer. But if I paint on the top here, it's actually going to be applied to the bottom. The bottom is the top now, because this polygon has been now rotated and flipped. This is no good when you're painting textures. Again, what you want is predictability. So I think that really explains it for this plane. So let's move on to another object called the cube. So let's move on to the cube. And we will once again do the same thing that we did with the plane. And we're going to press M. And I'm going to apply this UV test map to this. Or material. But again, it has no UV map assigned. So we have nothing right now. So what we're going to do is we're once again going to use the projection tool. And I'm going to just apply it. And we don't get anything yet. So I'm just going to reapply my material. And now we get a result. Well, this is fine and dandy. We get our projection mapped from the z-axis once again. And the back of the model also has, been projected onto. Of course, only one side is readable. The other one, not so much. So what happens here? Well, same thing that happened earlier. If I project from this view here, if I actually select this polygon, you will notice that this polygon, it's very faint, but it's been selected right across the top. And if I delete, or if I go to options in my UV view, and if I get rid of show UV overlap, it's not going to show me my overlapping polygons by, showing me the red marking. But anyways, if I select this top polygon, you'll notice that it has UVs. It is in the UV view. You can see it. But once again, it's being looked at this way. So it's not really useful because what happens is the last pixels in a texture map are black. So they are just streaking along this part of the model. This is no good. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to click here and here. I'm going to select the projection tool again. I'm going to click, and this time I'm going to be projecting from the Y. So I'm just going to click Y while this tool is still active. And we get something like that, which is nice. I'm also going to do that here and here. I'm going to reapply the projection tool again. And this time I'm going to choose the X-axis. So now we have this object pretty much UV'd. But again, for the sake of predictability, this object is kind of useless. Because a lot of this stuff I can't read because it's all backwards. Again, if it's backwards, it's useless. So what I'm going to have to do is I'm going to have to select these polygons and try to use flip. And that worked for this polygon. I'm going to use flip here. And once again, that worked. I'm going to use flip. And there you go. And now every single polygon is As far as I can tell, readable. So that's good. Now the only downside to this now is that every single polygon, if I click in the UV view, you'll notice, actually if I go back to my options and I click show UV overlap, you'll notice that every single one of these polygons is overlapping one another. What this means is that every single one of these or faces has identical space on the texture map. So if I paint a circle on this, if I go back to paint again, and I go back to my paint tools, and I make sure I go to my shader tree, and I make sure that my texture is in fact selected, because Modo can only paint on the currently selected texture. So if you have multiple objects, multiple textures, you have to select the textures first. So select airbrush, this here, and pick whatever color, and we're just going to paint right across the middle. Well, now you'll notice that every single one of these faces has that. But what if you want to have, what if you want to paint something very specific towards on one face and not so much on the other? Maybe some blood splatters or maybe some mold, and you want to have that on one side and not so much on the other. What if you want each one of these to have a different color? Well, with this method, you can't really do that because every single face has the same space on the texture. So what you're going to have to do in this case, if you want to keep the UVing as pretty much as it is, what you're going to have to do is go back once again to the UV view, select one of these polygons, hit the move button, and make sure you have that selected in the UV view and not the 3D view. If you notice, whenever I click between these, my options and my properties have in fact changed for that tool. In the UV view, my options are different. I have the tear off option, which allows me to tear off the polygon from the actual object. Now, what you have to remember is that this UV, even though it's been broken out from the object, it's still a part of the object. I don't have to worry about this. So if I, for example, click on this object or click on this polygon in my UV view, and then I try to move it, it's still a part of it. So I don't have to worry about this. UVs are completely separate. It's almost like a virtual representation of how it's going to be unwrapped. It's virtual, pretty much. At least to, the way it appears to us. Under the hood, it is an actual existing geometry set. But again, we don't have to worry about whenever we disconnect anything in our UV viewport, we don't have to worry about that breaking our actual model. Our model does not change. Everything is the same, except unless, of course, you use actual modeling operations to do your UVs, which you can. So what would happen if I didn't use the tear off option? Well, what's going to happen is I'm going to go back, undo a few steps. And once again, I'm going to select that polygon and I'm going to hit move and I'm going to get rid of the tear off button and I'm going to move that. Well, now you notice that all the vertices, points and edges, everything that was connected to this object, well, they're connected. Well, this is no good because what happens now is now that I've moved this polygon over, we have some distorted areas on this model. Not exactly what we want. What we really wanted was to, again, just use tear off and move the polygons that way. So I'm going to keep selecting these polygons on the model and not in the UV view because, again, whenever I select this and I have overlapping polygons, it's going to select every single polygon that's overlapping. This is no good. So I'm just going to select the polygon, move it out of the way, wherever, it really doesn't matter. And now I have 6 polygons, which is exactly how many faces a cube has. Well, in order for me to utilize this space and make sure that all these polygons are equally distributed on this texture map within this 0 to 1 space, I'm going to have to use the UV pack tool. So I'm just going to click on this, and I usually get rid of orient, and I set this to about 50%, usually, and then click OK. Now you'll notice that every single one of these polygons is an equal size, like this. And if I, for example, go back to paint and paint on any one of these parts, only that one polygon will receive the paint. If I choose a different color, on this polygon, it will in fact receive that color, and so on. If I, for example, paint even in my 3D viewport, same result. So every single one of these has a unique space on its texture map. So I'm just going to undo that because I don't need it. And I think I can only undo so much with paint. Whoops. Anyways, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to reload that texture map. So I'm going to go into the Images tab here, and I'm going to right click on the texture, go to Reload. Are you sure? Yes, I do. And I have a fresh texture to how it was actually saved on the hard drive. So the cube is pretty much done. There's a few methods and tools that I could be using, to basically give me more production proven or more friendly kind of texture maps. But I'm going to explore that, in the next videos. So for this video, I'm pretty much done. I'm going to next explore the functionalities of spherical and cylindrical mapping.